Hi everybody. Well, first of all, thank you to everyone who has joined my channel, and I really appreciate the comments that you've left. Have been very motivating and helpful. Someone said they couldn't quite hear me, so I have invested in a microphone, and I hope that helps with sound issues. So today I wanted to really talk about the increasingly perilous state of the United Kingdom, of this country. I think many people feel now that every new dawn under this new government brings another level of Orwellian dystopia. I use that term Orwellian purposefully. Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister, and the membership of the Labour Party in general are members of the Fabian Society. In fact, I believe I'm correct in saying that every Prime Minister, Labour Party, British Prime Minister, has been a member of the Fabian Society, and indeed many Labour politicians across the Commonwealth too. The objective of the Fabian Society, which was founded in 1884, is socialism, but it is socialism via gradualist and reformist effort rather than bloody revolution. It is in fact no less Marxist than any other form of socialism, but socialism with English characteristics in its eschewal of violent takeover. It was immortalised as Ingsoc in George Orwell's famous novel 1984. So Orwell, whose real name, by the way, was Eric Blair, Orwell was his nom de plume. Orwell replaced the E in ENG for England with I, hence Ingsoc. 1984, of course, was also 100 years after the founding of the Fabian Society in 1884, which is why I mentioned that year. And wrote 1984 and 1948, so he claimed that, 1984 was simply a reversal of the last two digits, so 48 becomes 84, but it's more likely that this was a guise to hide the real reason for setting it in 1984, 100 years after the founding of the Fabian Society. So the next point to make on the Fabian Society, its logo is a wolf in sheep's clothing. If that doesn't terrify you itself, I don't know what will. But it is literally a wolf in sheep's clothing. And that logo can be seen, it's openly used by the Fabian Society, but it can be seen, it was there from the start. It can be seen among other places in the Fabian Society stained glass window. There's a Fabian Society stained glass window in the George Bernard Shaw Library at the LSE, London School of Economics, which was incidentally founded by Fabians. And you can say, the stained glass window is, it's indicative perhaps that socialism is seen as a religion to some. So the Fabian Society motto, often accompanied by a tortoise, or the image of a tortoise, is, when I strike hard. And the idea behind that is that socialism under the Fabian guise would advance slowly through what Rutger Deutschke, the German activist Marxist, called the Long March through the institutions, through government and political institutional infiltration, which is what happened in the UK through the organisation called Common Purpose for many years. And then once in a position of power, it would strike hard. When I strike hard. I come slowly infiltrating through this gradualist, reformist takeover in the institutions, of the civil service, of other institutions of state, and now also private corporations. And then once in a position of power, I strike hard. I implement my ideology in an uncompromising way. So what we're seeing now, under obviously a very strong majority Labour government, is Keir Starmer's Labour Party striking hard. And we see this in so many policies and approaches. I'm going to talk a bit about farming because that's been a great deal in the news. So, as probably many are aware, from the 6th of April 2026, unless the government backs down, the full 100% relief from inheritance tax for farmers will be restricted to the first £1 million of combined agricultural and business property. Now, this indicates a fundamental failure on the part of the Chancellor and the civil service to understand agricultural capex, capital expenditure, because, of course, cost of a new tractor, cost of a new barn, fencing, combine harvester is often in the millions. That fundamental misunderstanding is indicated simply through the differences in claims between the government, which suggests 27% of farmers will be affected by changes to inheritance tax, and by stark contrast, the position of the NFU, the National Farmers Union, which has demonstrated that, in fact, 75% of farms stand to be above the £1 million family farm tax threshold. Now, some leftist commentators in The Guardian and elsewhere have lauded this as some kind of economic justice. They've pointed to a handful of very rich landowners and, in some cases, aristocratic landowners. And they've said, farmers have hoarded land too long. This was actually a headline in an article by Will Hutton in The Guardian. Farmers have hoarded land, family farms have hoarded land is an atrocious Marxist epithet. It's completely unconscionable. Obviously, farmers hold large amounts of land, and that land is necessary for maintaining the environment and preserving it, and putting it to good, productive use. One has to question whether leftist commentators have abandoned the ideals of buying local and minimize food imports to reduce carbon footprints. Has all of these considerations gone out of the window? Because, to be clear, if family farms are forced to sell off small parcels of land, that land is not going to be taken up by smallholders with new ideas and approaches, as Will Hutton suggested in his outrageous and disingenuous article in The Guardian, because they won't be able to afford to. Farmers are not wealthy, and they're certainly not going to get huge returns on small holdings. So, the underlying premise is the same failed socialist pipe dream. Deconstruct society, rebuild it as some mythical antediluvian idyll of collectivist whatever. And what are we going to see next? Are we going to see, the policies that were implemented by Stalin in the 1930s in the former Soviet Union? Are we going to have collectives? Are we going to have food quotas? Are we going to impose neo-Lamarckist, Lysenkoist approaches to food production that caused all the famines in the mid-20th century in the Soviet Union? Thing is outrageous and ridiculous. And then Starmer's meeting with Larry Fink, the chief executive officer of BlackRock, who, by the way, along with State Street and Vanguard, now own about 40% of all wealth on Earth. 90% of the Standard & Poor 500 index companies are BlackRock or State Street, Vanguard owned, and they hold shareholdings in each other, so they effectively own each other. But BlackRock specifically has interests in farming land through its Nutrition Fund and World Agriculture Fund. So a cynic would look at all of this and see what's sort of happening, and their conclusion will be, well, this is about the centralization of ownership of land and taking control of that land, and thus controlling people's most basic of needs. I mean, if you take Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Access to food, water, that's right there at the bottom. This is essential for survival. And to take that away and to centralize ownership of the production of food might be taken as something straight out of the Communist Manifesto, right? There's something authoritarian and robotic. I think a lot of people have observed this. There's something authoritarian and robotic in Starmer's mannerism. A severe poker face, and even on an eponymic analysis of his surname, what do we hear? I mean, what do we see? Storming, Stasi, stammering, staccato, stoic, star chamber, harm. All these terms are related to Starmer, and I would argue consciously or unconsciously evoked through his surname. And there's a school of thought as well that nomenclature can be nominatively determinist, i.e. the names that someone carries or that are given to someone or something can determine their character. Starmer is certainly heir to Tony Blair, yet he's more dangerous. And why is he more dangerous than Blair? Well, and by the way, if you want to listen to a far more informed perspective on this than I am able to give, listen to Peter Hitchens. Well, Princely, I would argue, because he left Tony Blair's domestic policy on terror in disarray, purposefully. As we know, Keir Starmer was a barrister. He still is. He carries the title, King's Counsel. So his career as a barrister was spent defending the human rights of murderers and terrorists. Fact. He campaigned as a barrister pro bono to end the death penalty in Jamaica. And his interventions led to a Privy Council judgment in 1993 and the banning of the death penalty altogether in Jamaica in 2004. Now, you may have different views on the death penalty. I don't think it's a clear-cut subject. But the effect of his intervention was that subsequently violent crime and murder rates skyrocketed. And Jamaica now has the highest murder rate in the world. Starmer also wrote a textbook on the interpretation of the Convention of Human Rights, specifically in relation to the 1,500 European Court of Human Rights cases relating to the UK, following its incorporation onto the UK statute book by virtue of Tony Blair's 1998 Human Rights Act. And this was effectively a operating manual for barristers. How do we suddenly, all public bodies, including courts, are duty-bound to have regard to the European Convention on Human Rights and must be able to interpret it. And thus all this European Court of Human Rights case law became binding on the UK and would have to be followed. So Starmer rather helpfully provided some guidance on how to interpret all this judgment. From 2000 to 2008, so in 2008, Starmer was appointed Director of Public Prosecutions. He's working at the Doughty Street Chambers, and he took on numerous cases seeking to relax or remove restrictions on terrorists. So Starmer thus undermined the efforts of the Labour government itself and Labour government ministers to tackle the jihadist terrorist threats. By 2007, Starmer had secured 3 legal victories against Labour Home Secretary John Reid's control orders. So these were orders that impose curtailments on the movement suspects. He also defended suspects, including a close associate of Abu Hamza and Finsbury Park Mosque. Its name is undisclosed, but referred to in the case reports as Y. So Starmer defended this person Y from being deported to Algeria. The reason why was because Y faced a death sentence for organising an armed group in Algeria. So Starmer helped to keep someone who was provably, objectively dangerous in the country. Starmer then also represented someone called Khalid Al-Fawaz from extradition to the US, where he was wanted for conspiring to bomb a number of American embassies. And in 2008, Starmer represented Hizb ut-Tahrir, the Islamic terrorist group, when the group tried to overturn a ban against it in Germany. To be clear, this was not simply Starmer taking on the cases because, as a barrister, you're obliged to take on certain cases that come your way. It's called the cab rank rule. But because he wanted to, he found time to take on these cases. He was an activist, a particular ideology that he was implementing. And the irony, of course, is that these extreme jihadist, terrorist and terror groups are ultra-authoritarian, they're ultra-conservative, they're ultra-Islamic nativist and Islam supremacist. And therefore, on an objective understanding of the term far right, they meet all the commonly understood markers of far right and far right thuggery, a term that Keir Starmer has recently misdirected at many people who have been arrested and convicted wrongly in the increasingly two-tier and, let's be clear, race, religion and class-based approach to justice or injustice that we have seen since the Labour government and Keir Starmer came to power at the last general election. Justice is no longer blind in this country, and arguably hasn't been for some time, but this has all become now exponentially worse. This is the typical position of the left, by which I mean defending the other. Whether or not its ideological starting point is equality, in-group dissociation, or even ego-driven gluttony from some kind of moral superiority, it's evident even, I think, to those in the same ideological tent that it's warped entirely out of all proportion. The cult, the political cult, may have become more insane, but its older members remember its previous, more sane iteration, and they long for that to return. But the drive for ever greater progress, and of course that term is propaganda in itself. What is progress except what progressives define it as? In their narcissistic drive for moral superiority, progressives, leftists, we should say, project onto others what they see as their own shadows. In reality, those shadows are in fact good things. They're concerned for truth, responsibility and courage. But they project that as something undesirable onto the other, and then run away from their responsibilities. They run away from themselves. And society then is left to pick up the pieces or remains from the deconstruction. or indeed society remains deconstructed as greater dysfunctionality is normalized. And the cycle repeats itself unless people push back and fight against it. And even Tony Blair said at the time that should legal objections arise to the deportation of terrorist suspects, Labour would rewrite the Human Rights Act if necessary. But of course that did not happen. Starmer was too radical, even for Blair. And while Starmer has managed his PR and his image more effectively than Jeremy Corbyn, is he any different? It all flipped in 2008 when Starmer became DPP, the Director for Public Prosecutions. At that point, he realised, because he was trying to establish himself politically and build a political career, in 2008 he was already being introduced to Labour Party figures by Ed Miliband. So Starmer changed his direction, decided then he was going to get tough. Well, he had to, as direct prosecutions. But it's clear if Starmer was willing to change his direction to seize power, an indication incidentally of psychopathy, which is not, to be fair, unknown in politics. Can we trust anything that he says? And more to the point, do we want to live in a Fabian society strike hard experiment? The one that we're living through now? Well, the millions signing the petition calling for a general election to be held now clearly do not.